The morning sunlight streamed through the courtroom windows, reflecting off the polished wooden floor, creating an atmosphere that was both formal and heavy with tension. The rows of seats in the gallery were packed with a curious crowd. The townspeople, reporters, justice supporters, and tense faces waiting for the trial to unfold. In the center of the room, at the defense table, Hannah sat upright, her hands neatly placed on her lap. Her long black hair was tied back, and her sharp eyes scanned the courtroom with precise observation. She wasn't a typical defendant. There was something about her that made the entire courtroom sense an unusual calmness. In stark contrast to Hannah's composure, across the room, Parabal, the police officer filing the lawsuit, lounged in his chair with a smug expression. He wore his uniform impeccably, his chest adorned with badges, exuding the air of a man accustomed to power and submission. His colleagues sat behind him, exchanging confident glances. To them, this was an easy case. A white officer accusing a black woman of resisting arrest. With the typical legal process, the outcome seemed almost predetermined. Judge Howard Grayson, a middle-aged man with silver hair and a face etched with the marks of decades in the legal profession, entered the courtroom. He adjusted his glasses, scanned the room, and then declared, "The state's case against Hannah begins now." Whispers died down as the tension in the room grew thick. The prosecutor, a sharp-looking man with calculating eyes, stood up and moved forward. "Your Honor, the prosecution will present a clear and undeniable case. The defendant, Hannah, violently resisted arrest and attempted to seize the weapon of Officer Parabal. The officer was carrying out his duties in accordance with the law, for the safety of the community. The defendant's actions are unacceptable and worthy of punishment." Whispers rippled through the courtroom as the prosecutor emphasized each word. Parabal smirked subtly, his gaze passing over Hannah with quiet triumph. He believed everything was going according to plan, but Hannah remained seated. No sign of panic, no hint of confusion, just a quiet determination, a storm hidden beneath her calm exterior. Next to her, Benjamin Carter, a young but sharp lawyer, gently gripped his pen. He knew that things were far more complicated than Parabal thought, because the truth they were about to reveal would change the entire course of the case. The atmosphere in the courtroom was thick, like a storm waiting to burst. The sound of Parabal's boots echoed as he stepped up to the witness stand, adjusting his police badge on his uniform. With a confident expression, he looked directly at the jury before taking the oath. The prosecutor stepped forward, flashing a confident smile. "Officer Bal, could you walk us through what happened that night?" Parabal cleared his throat, his gaze briefly passing over Hannah before he focused on the story he had rehearsed in his mind. "At around 11 p.m. that night," he began, "I received a call about a suspicious individual in the east side of the city. When I arrived, I found the defendant, Ms. Hannah, loitering outside a closed store." The prosecutor nodded. "And when you approached her?" "I asked her to produce identification," Parabal said, his tone calm but authoritative. "She immediately became hostile, refused to cooperate, and shouted at me. When I tried to remain calm and asked her to comply, she assaulted me." Whispers filled the courtroom. Hannah sat still at the defense table, her eyes unwavering. The prosecutor continued, "Can you describe the defendant's actions in more detail?" "She punched me in the chest," Parabal said, placing his hand on his chest as though still feeling the blow. "Then she lunged at me, trying to grab my weapon. I had no choice but to restrain her." A wave of murmurs rippled through the gallery. Some shook their heads, while others scribbled down notes hastily. The jury exchanged glances, trying to assess the credibility of this testimony. From the defense table, Benjamin Carter watched Parabal closely. He noticed the slight tension in the officer's hand, gripping the witness stand, the way his shoulder stiffened when he mentioned being attacked. These details, insignificant to an average person, were red flags to a sharp lawyer like Benjamin, signs of a story that wasn't entirely truthful. When the prosecutor finished his questioning, he gave a satisfied smile. "Thank you, Officer Ball. Nothing further, Your Honor." Judge Grayson nodded. "Mr. Carter, would you like to cross-examine the witness?" Benjamin stood up, adjusting his jacket before walking slowly toward the stand. He paused for a moment, letting the silence hang in the air. "Officer Ball," Benjamin said, his voice calm yet sharp, "are you absolutely certain about your testimony?" Parabal squinted. "I'm completely sure." Benjamin smiled lightly. "Then let's clear up a few details." The courtroom fell silent. Everyone knew Benjamin's cross-examination could change the entire direction of the case. Hannah slowly walked up to the witness stand. She stood tall, her gaze unwavering. The courtroom fell silent, every eye fixed on her. Even Parabal, who had just stepped down from the stand with a smug look, sat up straighter, his hands instinctively clenching on the table. Benjamin Carter stepped forward, slow yet steady. "Ms. Hannah, can you walk us through what happened that night?" Hannah took a slight breath before beginning. "That evening, I had left a friend's house and stopped at the corner of Magnolia and 5th to check my phone for directions." She paused for a moment, her voice steady but carrying an invisible weight. "That's when Officer Parabal approached me." "And what did he say?" Benjamin asked, his gaze sharp as a knife slicing through every word she spoke. Hannah looked straight at the jury. "He asked me what I was doing there. When I told him I was just checking the map, he asked for my ID." "Did you refuse?" Hannah slightly tilted her head. "I asked him why I had to do that. I wasn't causing trouble. I wasn't breaking any laws." But as soon as I asked that, his tone changed. Whispers spread across the courtroom. Some jurors leaned forward, paying closer attention to her. Benjamin nodded. "Can you elaborate on that change, Ms. Hannah?" Hannah tightened her grip on the witness stand, but her voice remained steady. "He became aggressive. He stepped closer, raised his voice, saying I wasn't cooperating and that I was resisting." She glanced over at Parabal, who was now staring down at the table. "Then he grabbed my arm." A wave of shock rippled through the room. "He grabbed your arm?" Benjamin repeated, his voice sharp. Hannah nodded. "He gripped it tightly, and when I asked him to let go, he squeezed harder." The prosecutor sprang to his feet. "Objection! This is just one-sided testimony with no evidence." The judge banged his gavel. "Proceed, Mr. Carter." Benjamin didn't take his eyes off Hannah. "So, what happened next?" Hannah took a deep breath. "I tried to pull my arm away, but he shoved me into the patrol car and cuffed me. I didn't resist, but he yelled that I was attacking him. Everything happened so fast." "So, did you ever try to grab his weapon?" Hannah looked straight into Benjamin's eyes. "No." The room became so quiet that you could hear everyone's breath. Parabal sat frozen while the prosecutor glanced at him with growing concern. Benjamin took a step forward, his voice lowering. "Then, why do you think Officer Parabal accused you?" Hannah didn't take her eyes off the jury. "Because he thought I would stay silent." The courtroom erupted with murmurs. A shockwave ran through the entire trial. Hannah sat upright on the witness stand, her gaze sweeping the courtroom before settling on Parabal. The man sitting at the plaintiff's table had lost the initial confidence he once held, his hands clasped together, his face tense. Benjamin Carter stood near the witness stand, adjusting his tie carefully. He looked at the jury, then turned to Hannah. "Ms. Hannah, when you were arrested, Did you resist? Hannah took a deep breath, her voice steady. No. Did you raise your voice or make any threats toward Officer Parabal? No. Benjamin paused for a moment to let Hannah's testimony sink into the minds of everyone present. He then pulled a file from his briefcase. Are you aware that the video from Officer Parabal's body camera malfunctioned that night? Hannah nodded. I am aware. Do you think that was a coincidence? Hannah turned to look directly at Parabal. No, I don't think so. Whispers spread throughout the courtroom. The jury exchanged glances, and the prosecutor stood up sharply. Objection! This is pure speculation. Judge Grayson banged his gavel. Mr. Carter, stick to the facts. Benjamin nodded. He walked to the center of the room, his gaze firm. Ms. Hannah, please tell the court what really happened that night. Hannah clenched her hands lightly, but her voice remained calm. I was standing on the sidewalk, checking my directions on my phone when Officer Parabal approached me. I wasn't breaking any laws, but he asked me for my ID. I asked why, and immediately his tone changed. He raised his voice, almost threatening. The prosecutor crossed his arms, clearly trying to find a way to refute this. But Hannah continued, not allowing anyone to interrupt her. When I asked him to explain why he needed my ID, he grabbed my arm. I didn't resist. I just wanted him to let go. But instead of doing that, he shoved me into the patrol car and cuffed me. Parabal's breathing became more rapid. Benjamin slowly walked toward the jury. So, you did nothing wrong, didn't resist, but were still arrested? Yes. Benjamin nodded. So, why do you think Officer Parabal accused you? Hannah looked directly into the eyes of the jury. Because he thought I wouldn't be able to defend myself. Because he believed that a woman like me has no voice. The courtroom fell silent. The jury was still, and Parabal kept his head bowed. But no one in the room could deny that the wall of lies was beginning to crumble. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavy. After Hannah's powerful testimony, all eyes were on Parabal. The officer, once full of pride, now sat stiffly, his hands clenched, avoiding the sharp gazes of the jury. Benjamin Carter stood tall, his cold gaze directed at the prosecutor before turning to Hannah. Ms. Hannah, did you use any force against Officer Parabal that night? No, Hannah answered succinctly. Benjamin nodded, then picked up a file and held it up before the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the official report of the incident from that night, submitted by Officer Parabal. In it, he claims that my client assaulted him and tried to seize his weapon. Whispers echoed in the courtroom. Some of the jury exchanged skeptical glances. Benjamin moved closer to Parabal, his eyes sharp as a blade. Officer Parabal, do you still stand by your claim that Hannah attacked you first? Parabal cleared his throat, trying to maintain his composure. Yes, she was aggressive. I had to restrain her to ensure safety. Safety for whom? Benjamin asked, his tone direct, making Parabal uneasy. For me, she was acting suspiciously. Benjamin interrupted. Did she have a weapon? Parabal swallowed hard. No. Did she threaten you verbally? Parabal pressed his lips together. No. Benjamin turned to the jury. So why would a well-trained officer, fully equipped, feel threatened by a woman standing still on the sidewalk? He turned back to Parabal. Or did you attempt to cover up a wrongful action? The murmurs in the room grew louder. The prosecutor stood up to object, but Judge Grayson raised his hand, signaling for him to sit down. Benjamin walked to the defense table, pulling out a USB drive and holding it up. Your Honor, the defense would like to present an important piece of evidence. A video appeared on the large screen in the courtroom. The footage, recorded by an onlooker, clearly showed Hannah not engaging in any violent actions. It showed Parabel approaching her with a hostile attitude, shoving her into the patrol car before cuffing her without any legitimate reason. The room fell silent. Some members of the jury shook their heads in disbelief. Parabel clenched his fists, his face pale as he witnessed his lie being exposed to the public. Benjamin turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, the truth needs no embellishment. The truth is right here, before your eyes." He paused for a moment before continuing. "Justice cannot be based on lies. Today, we are here to do what is right." Hannah remained calm, but everyone could see the light of victory in her eyes. She knew that the wall of lies had begun to crumble, and the truth would always find a way to speak. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew more tense than ever. The video that had just been shown had left the entire room in silence. Some people shook their heads quietly, while others whispered to each other with doubtful glances. The jury stared intently at Parabel, the officer who had stood on the witness stand with confidence, now reduced to a figure of tension and unease. Hannah sat at the defense table, her sharp eyes following every movement of Parabel. She said nothing, but her presence made it impossible for him to ignore her. The evidence was clear. He knew that, but what was worse was that he knew the entire courtroom knew it too. Benjamin Carter stood up, his voice resonating with authority. "Officer Parabel, do you want to change your testimony?" Parabel swallowed hard, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. I was just following procedure." "Procedure?" Benjamin smirked, taking a step toward the witness stand. "Can you explain to the court what procedure allows a police officer to assault a law-abiding citizen who is unarmed and not resisting?" Parabel remained silent. "I'll ask again." Benjamin continued, his voice slow but sharp like a blade. "Did you misjudge Hannah? Did you abuse your power and, when exposed, try to cover up your actions with a lie?" Silence enveloped the courtroom. No one spoke. No one stood by Parabel now. "Ladies and gentlemen," Benjamin turned to the jury, "what we see today is not just a single case. This is an example of how power can be abused, how people with badges think they can escape justice by manipulating the truth. But today, we have a chance to send a clear message. No one, not even a police officer, can stand above the law." Hannah took a deep breath and slowly stood up. She walked toward the witness stand, facing Parabel. She didn't need to say much. Just one look from her was enough to make him lower his gaze. "You underestimated me," she said, her voice calm but sharp. "You thought I would remain silent, but you forgot one thing." She paused for a moment, her gaze sweeping across the courtroom. "The truth always finds a way to speak." The jury exchanged glances. Some nodded in agreement. Judge Grayson paused for a moment before speaking. "The jury will begin deliberations. Court is adjourned." As everyone stood up, Parabel remained seated, his eyes focused on the table, his hands trembling. Hannah didn't need to look at him again. She knew that the liar could not escape forever. And today, justice was closer than ever. When the jury returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere became so tense it felt as if it could be cut with a knife. Everyone knew this was the most important moment, the moment when justice would be determined. Hannah sat upright at the defense table, her eyes unwavering. Beside her, Benjamin Carter gripped the file tightly, his gaze resolute. Judge Grayson banged his gavel, signaling for silence. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The forewoman of the jury, a middle-aged woman with a serious expression, stood up holding a piece of paper. She glanced at Hannah before speaking. "In the case of the state versus Hannah, we find the defendant not guilty of all charges." The courtroom erupted. There were gasps from the crowd. Some clapped, others whispered among themselves. On the other side of the room, Parabal stiffened, his face ashen. He looked around, searching for someone to stand by him, but his former colleagues just avoided his gaze. Hannah let out a slow breath. Not because she doubted the verdict, but because finally the truth had been acknowledged. Judge Grayson nodded before continuing. Furthermore, the jury strongly recommends that an official investigation be opened into the actions of Officer Parabal. This time, an eerie silence fell over the courtroom. Parabal swallowed hard, his hand gripping the edge of the chair. Benjamin stood up, turned to look at Hannah, a faint smile appearing on his face. "Justice isn't just a verdict," he whispered. "It's a long step forward." Hannah stood, slowly walking toward Parabal. He looked at her, his eyes full of panic, but she paused only briefly before saying, "Do you think you can escape forever?" Parabal didn't respond. He knew the game was over. As Hannah walked out of the courthouse, a crowd of reporters waited. Questions flew at her relentlessly. "How do you feel about the verdict? Do you have anything to say to Parabal? What will you do next?" Hannah stopped, looking directly at the cameras. Her voice was as steady as steel. "Today is not just my victory," she said. "It is the victory of the truth, of justice, and of all those who have been trampled by people like Parabal. If there is one thing I want everyone to remember today, it is this: no one stands above the law, no one can hide the truth forever." Beside her, Benjamin nodded in agreement. And this is just the beginning. Applause erupted from supporters, and Hannah walked on, leaving behind lies, manipulation, and a system that tried to silence her. But today, she had proven one thing: justice always has its own voice. After the verdict was announced, the tension in the courtroom slowly dissipated, giving way to sighs of relief. Hannah stood there, silently watching the events unfold around her. She wasn't surprised by the outcome, but the feeling of truth being revealed still made her heart race. Beside her, Benjamin Carter smiled faintly. "We did it," he whispered. Hannah nodded, her gaze still fixed on Parabal. His face was pale, his hands clenched tightly on the edge of the table, as if desperately holding on to some last bit of power. But that power no longer meant anything. Parabal. Judge Grayson's voice cut through the silence, pulling everyone back to reality. "Based on the evidence and testimony presented in this trial, I am officially calling for a full investigation into your actions during your duty." Parabal swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the room. His former colleagues, the ones who had once backed him, now avoided his gaze. Alone and exposed before justice, he understood that everything was over. As Hannah and Benjamin exited the courthouse, a crowd of reporters and citizens had gathered, their cameras flashing as microphones were thrust forward and questions came at them in rapid succession. "Do you believe justice has been served? Do you have any message for those who doubted you? What's next for you?" Hannah paused for a moment, taking a deep breath before answering. "Today is not just my victory," she said, her voice steady. "It's the victory of all those who have been oppressed, discarded, and disrespected by those who abuse their power." The crowd fell silent, not because of the beauty of her words, but because they came from the truth, from someone who had fought and stood firm until the very end. "Justice is not an abstract concept," she continued. "It's something we must fight for every single day, and I'm not stopping here." Benjamin nodded in agreement. "We've broken one link in the chain of injustice, but there are still many more links that need to be brought to light." Hannah turned to look at Benjamin, a small smile on her lips. "Then we'll keep going." She stepped down the courthouse steps, each footfall firm and resolute. The crowd buzzed with excitement, but no one could deny one thing. A storm had risen, and it would not stop until justice was truly served. Hannah stepped down the courthouse steps, her eyes scanning the crowd of reporters jostling to capture the moment. The battle in the courtroom was over, but its echoes still lingered. Whispers, unanswered questions, and above all, the mixture of admiration and skepticism in the gazes directed toward her. Benjamin Carter walked alongside her, his briefcase still firmly in hand. "We turned the case around," he said softly, his voice still carrying the tension of a fierce legal battle. "No, we've only just begun," Hannah replied, her gaze fixed on Parabal, who was still surrounded by his former colleagues. They had once stood by him, but now the truth had forced them to keep their distance. A senior officer stepped forward, his expression serious. "Parabal, by order of the police department, you are suspended indefinitely pending investigation." The crowd murmured, microphones immediately turning toward the officer, but he merely nodded before turning and walking away. Parabal stood there, his eyes blazing with anger, but he could do nothing but remain silent. "Ms. Jackson," a reporter called out, using the name Hannah had carried throughout the trial. She turned, a faint smile on her lips. "Do you think this is true justice?" the reporter asked. Hannah looked directly into the camera lens. "Justice isn't just about one person being held accountable. True justice is when the system changes so that no one else has to go through what I've been through." Her words caused the crowd to fall silent for a moment. They understood that this wasn't just a single case, but a wake-up call. Benjamin stepped forward. "And to achieve that, we need to keep fighting. This isn't the end, but a beginning." Hannah nodded in agreement. "I spent 20 years protecting this country. Now, I will protect the people of this country from injustice." She turned away, stepping down the courthouse steps. The sun began to set, painting the sky red. But in her mind, a new path had just opened. A path toward truth, justice, and change. And Hannah knew she wouldn't be walking it alone. In the solemn atmosphere of the courtroom, the tension grew as the jury returned to their seats. The murmurs slowly faded as the judge motioned for everyone to remain silent. Hannah sat upright, her gaze calm but sharp, as if she had anticipated this outcome. Parabal sat across from her, his face pale, his hands gripping the edge of the table. His fingers clenched so tightly they turned white. He had once believed that his power would help him avoid punishment, but now the truth had paved a different path, a path he could no longer control. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The judge's voice rang out, deep and authoritative. A middle-aged woman stood up, holding the verdict in her hands, her gaze sweeping the room before speaking clearly. "In the case of the state versus Hannah Jackson, we find the defendant not guilty on all charges." A moment of silence filled the room before whispers erupted. Some people cheered, while others exchanged glances, reporters hurriedly scribbling down every detail. Hannah let out a slow breath, but her expression showed no sign of surprise. She had fought not just to protect herself, but to expose the truth. And today, justice had prevailed. Benjamin Carter gently placed his hand on her shoulder, a smile flickering across his face. "We did it." The judge nodded before making his final statement. Based on the evidence presented, the court also calls for a full investigation into the actions of Officer Parabal. All eyes turned to him. He no longer carried the arrogant demeanor he once had. His eyes darted around the room, searching for someone to support him, but his former colleagues only avoided his gaze. Hannah stood, adjusted her jacket, and walked away from the witness stand. She didn't look at Parabal again, for to her, the battle was over. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered, waiting for the results. As she appeared, they applauded and cheered, not only because she had won, but because she had dared to stand against an unjust system. A reporter quickly rushed over. "Ms. Jackson, do you have anything to say?" Hannah stopped, looking straight into the camera lens. "This isn't just my victory, it's the victory of truth, of justice, of all those who have no voice, and I promise I won't stop here." She turned and walked away, leaving behind applause and faces filled with hope. The fight for justice was far from over, but Hannah was ready for the journey ahead. Through the story of Hannah Jackson, we learn a profound lesson about the power of truth and justice. Despite facing oppression, injustice, and deliberate lies, one can overturn any force that seeks to hide the truth by remaining steadfast in it. Hannah fought not only to defend her own honor, but also to expose a decaying system that had enabled power abusers like Parabal. She demonstrated that courageously standing against injustice not only helps one reclaim justice, but also opens the door for others to be protected. Her journey reminds us that while the truth can be hidden for a moment, it will never be completely extinguished. Once the light of truth is shown, the liars will never escape. The story also serves as a warning that power is not immune to responsibility. Those who use it to oppress others will eventually pay the price. Justice is not only created by the law, but also by those who dare to protect it, no matter how much pressure or danger they face. Hannah was not the only one treated unjustly, but she chose not to remain silent, and it was her persistence that helped her win. Her story is an inspiration for anyone who has ever felt small in the face of injustice, showing that with courage and determination, justice will ultimately prevail. Thank you for watching. If you found this video interesting or enjoyable, please show your support by giving it a thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow and reach more amazing viewers like you. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on our future uploads. Your support means the world to us and keeps us motivated to create even better content for you.